In this Open Dev training, we'll have a look at one of the fundamentals. What is the difference between fleet vehicles and privately owned cars? The difference which will determine how vehicle activation is done and also what data is available and for what purposes. So let's have a look into it, and we'll start with just visualizing it shortly by looking at this screen. And if you look at the screen, this is how basically we as High Mobility operate. We have the vehicle manufacturers on one side. We ingest the data based on vehicle activations, and then we provide it to our customer for the different services that are using connected car data. On one hand side, we have fleet operators. So that is then the fleet owners, could be car rental companies, could be corporate fleets, using that data, who want to access the data of their fleet. Could also be fleet solution providers who are in between and integrating the data into complete systems. And then we have private drivers. So that is then a private vehicle owner who is looking to use a service, and that service can make use of the connected car data, for instance, for insurance policies based on the mileage. And this distinction is quite important because depending on which category you fall into, there are different ways of how generally, technically, data is being integrated, but also how you have to take care of different or GDPR compliance in general, and how you technically and operationally implement that in your system. So the main or the easiest way to really put it is that fleet vehicles are vehicles that are owned by business entities and not owned by private or natural persons. That's really the easiest way to put it. And then a fleet vehicle can really be a fleet of one, could be a fleet of hundreds of thousands of vehicles. But that is the kind of key part here. And then when it comes to getting the consent or activation, it's also a different process for that, because technically speaking, if you want to activate or request consent from one person owning a car, it's quite different than activating tens of thousands of vehicles in a fleet, and that looks a bit different. So we'll have a look at that distinction right away by opening up our platform. So in our platform, this is the first screen you'll see if you get into it and have access. And we can see here in our documentation, we can quickly show you how that looks like. So we start with the fleet case. So we go into our documentation. In our documentation, we have tons of material, but perhaps the easiest way to really illustrate this is by looking at our fleet clearance API. So this is already like a technical specification, but this shows you really the endpoint of activating vehicles. So it's a server-to-server integration. So from your server, you can connect to us using our API. Once you have an activated data container on our platform, and then you can activate vehicles by passing in the VIN and the brand. So this can be any of the many brands that we support for fleet data, and then we start the activation process. There are some other steps in between from manufacturer to manufacturer, but in a nutshell, that's how it looks like. So no matter if you want to activate one vehicle or hundreds of vehicles, you can always pass in that right into this API to start the activation process. It is an asynchronous process, so as soon as we get it, it depends on the manufacturer. Sometimes we have to send an instruction to the vehicle to start collecting this data and sending it, and then you start to receive that data. There are tons of other things that goes into this in the background, and we go deeper into these details in the other Open Dev training videos. For private consumers, it's a bit different because, of course, you cannot just send in a VIN. You need to really have directly, or there is a built-in functionality for capturing consent, which is then provided from the manufacturers and also from us from High Mobility. So instead of validating or getting the agreement from a fleet owner, in this case there is no fleet owner, you need to get the consent directly from the driver, who is also the owner of the vehicle. Let's have a look at one example. So if I open here a consent journey, so this is what the drivers or the vehicle owners experience when they start to share data with your service if you're building for private consumers. So instead of using the API to activate the cars, you would forward your user to this workflow. And I can choose to sign in. So here I go and sign in with my account. I just need to get my password here as well. And then we show directly the user what data is being accessed. So this is just test application. I have already a few vehicles in my account, so it's a selected one by default. The last one I used, and then it shows really myself in this case, or in the end user, the owner of the vehicle, what data will be accessed. For instance, charging data, and it shows a full list of different data points. If there's any diagnostics data like the odometer value or trouble codes, everything is shown right here in this consent prompt. So this might look a bit different from case to case, from manufacturer to manufacturer, really depending on how the manufacturer has implemented this. But this is a basic, good example of how this might look like, for instance, in this case, how we do it at Time of Lit site for BMW. So I can accept and continue, but I can also go in and add another vehicle, select one of the brands that this data container has been configured with, and then entering the VIN number. So as you can see, the workflow is quite different. In one, it's just an API, so it's abstract. It can be integrated into any system. But here, for private consumers, it's really this consent journey. It's a visual user experience that the owner of the vehicle goes through to get an understanding of what data is being accessed, for what purpose, and then they can go ahead and agree to sharing that data. And in the end, we also have different types of data sets that are then supported just for those different use cases. So sometimes for manufacturer, the data set can be different, and that's where we have different resources and tables to show for what manufacturer we support, and also importantly, what data we support for these private consumer use cases, but also for fleet use cases. So that's the good resource we are linking to in the description below. So hopefully that's useful, and see you in the next OpenDev training session.